good. I can't complain. But it has been interesting at that. You know, in life, all of us have to face difficult and sometimes critical decisions in our life. We don't like it. We hate it. We hate going through it, but we all have to do it. And those decisions can be both personal, but they can also be spiritual in nature. You know, a personal one that comes to mind is asking the person you love to marry you, and that whole fear of that, and wondering what they're going to say, and you know, just that whole thing, how your whole life is going to change. On the spiritual side, when you came to Jesus Christ, things changed in your life. There was a spiritual change that happened, but that was a critical decision that you made to accept Him as your personal Lord and Savior. You know, there are other times that are more difficult. Back in 1986, we had to make the decision to take my dad off of life support. Those are critical, life-changing things that happen. And we all face them, and we all hate those moments in our life, but yet we have to make them. They do change our life, and we want that to be for the better. And as I was working on this, and as we're going to be going through Joshua chapter 3 this morning, and as I was reading this story, I couldn't help but think that the Israelites were in that very same place. Moses had just died. Joshua has taken over. Joshua has told them that he's going to lead them into the promised land. They're now sitting near the Jordan River. And at this particular time, it's harvest time. It says later in chapter 3, we won't read that this morning, but it's harvest time, so the Jordan River is flooded. The scholars all say it was probably the month of April that they were there, because that was the harvest time at that time, and when the Jordan River would be overflowing its banks. And here they are sitting there. This generation did not know what their parents and grandparents had gone through. They didn't know, I mean, they heard the stories, but they didn't get to personally experience all that happened back in Egypt. And how Moses led them to the Red Sea, and how he parted the Red Sea and they were able to cross on dry land. They had heard that story, but they didn't experience it. They didn't know it. They had heard the stories how God had provided manna, and they had heard all the griping and complaining that had happened. And they themselves were even a part of that. But here they are on the banks of the Jordan River, facing a critical decision. Are they going to cross it, and how are they going to cross it? And what's going to happen when they get into the promised land? Is God really going to provide for them? Is God really going to do what He said He was going to do? So they had to make a decision. Are we going to follow Joshua and cross this river? Or are we going to stay on this side and miss what God has promised us? And that just kind of stuck in my head. We don't know how many there were, but there were a lot. And what were they going to do? And I love this chapter because it really spells out, number one, the Israelites' decision to move forward, but number two, that they've accepted Joshua as their leader. And they've accepted God as their leader, and they were going to follow Him. If you'll open your Bibles to Joshua chapter 3, we're not going to read the whole chapter. We'll talk about the whole chapter, but we're going to focus on just the first 5 verses, because that's where the sermon will come from this morning. starting in verse 1. We'll read verses 1 through 5. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and he and all the sons of Israel set out for Shittim and came to the Jordan. And they lodged there before they crossed. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the midst of the camp, and they commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord, your God, with the Levitical priests carrying it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it. However, there shall be between you and it a distance of about 2,000 cubits by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way by which you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. What a great verse. Just those 5 verses alone. There's some real truths that come out of that. That we need to learn, that the Israelites needed to learn. And Joshua was told back in chapter 1, if you'll remember back, that he was to be strong and courageous, and that the Lord would lead the way. He would be with them and he would lead them through this. But one of the first things you see in this chapter is Joshua is doing exactly that. The first thing you see here is that the Ark of the Covenant must go first. If you think back through Genesis and through Exodus, you see that the Ark of the Covenant actually represented the presence of God. And he was to go first. The priests were to carry that into the Jordan River. And the people were supposed to follow at a safe distance, and in this case, 2,000 cubits is about half a mile. So they were to be close enough that they could see where they were going, but yet not too close. And if you think back, there's a reason for that. Because if you got too close to the Ark of the Covenant, it was kind of a death sentence for you. You didn't dare get close enough to touch it. And the people knew that. Joshua knew that. And so he told them, you follow at a safe distance. But you follow them and do go where they tell you to go. There's a real truth in that for us as well, because if we aren't following God, if we're not letting him lead us, then we're going to put ourselves into dangerous places. You see, if the people just decided they were going to cross the Jordan River, in flood stage nonetheless, it was not going to look pretty for them. They were probably going to perish in the river. But if they followed the Ark of the Covenant, if they followed God, he was going to provide the way for them. He was going to get them across that Jordan River. But they had to follow. And they had to put God first. You see, that's a beautiful picture for us as well, because if we haven't put God first in our life, guess what? We're going to walk into dangerous places, and we're not going to have the protection of him in it. If we haven't given God our life, if we haven't given our lives to Jesus Christ, then we're going to walk into a dangerous place, because if something happens to us, we face an eternity in hell instead of an eternity in heaven. If we as Christ followers don't put him first and we don't follow him, then we're going to find ourselves in deep water as well. Because God has promised to be with us, but if we aren't listening and if we aren't doing what he's calling us to do, then we have a problem. And it's probably not going to go well, and we're going to find ourselves in a bad place. You see, as pastors and counselors, we're there, we hear it a lot. We counsel people that come to us and who made those bad decisions. They were Christians, but they didn't listen. And they chose to go their own way, and they chose to do their own thing, and then they find themselves in a mess. And they need us to help them get out of it and get back onto sure footing. We're all vulnerable to that. Nobody is not vulnerable to that. If I'm not listening to him and if I'm not following him, I'm going to lead you in a way you all shouldn't go. Every one of us has to be conscious of that. Every one of us has to remember that God must go first. Not us. Not us jumping in front of him and doing what we think is best and what we think God should do. We've got to stop. We've got to listen, and we've got to know when to go. And we've got to follow. That's the first truth that comes out of this. It absolutely is vital. The second thing that we read this morning is that Joshua told them to consecrate themselves. They were to set themselves apart. They were to become a holy people. And they obviously did because God provided and they crossed the Jordan River. So they obviously did in that time, that night. They spent it consecrating and setting themselves apart for God. You all have heard me preach message after message on holiness, but I can't tell you enough how important that is. We have to consecrate ourselves. We have to be different. We have to set ourselves up that way. If we put God first, yes, it can be difficult, but yes, it's possible, and every one of us should be doing that. It's easy to get into, like I talked about a couple of weeks ago, it's easy to get into our comfort zones and to, this is where I'm comfortable and this is where I'm okay, and I don't want to go outside that, and I don't want to be made fun of, and I don't want people to look at me any different, so I'm willing to maybe compromise in a couple of areas. It's not going to affect me. But it does. And it will continue to do that. We have to set our lives apart. We have to be willing to live a life of holiness. We have to look different. If we want people to follow us as Christians, then they need to see that we're different. That we have things that we stand for, that we have morals, and we have a way of God that we are not going to compromise for them or anybody else. That's exactly what the Israelite people did. They spent that day and night consecrating themselves, living their life, praying to God, asking for his guidance and direction. They set themselves apart for him. And that's exactly what he did. And as you read, if we were to read on, you would see that they do cross the Jordan River. And not only do they cross the Jordan River, as soon as the priests step into it, the water separates, the ground dries up, and they cross the Jordan River on dry ground. Just as their ancestors did through the Red Sea, he did it again for them. The ancestors of those got to see exactly what God did for them. And the beautiful picture here is that as they crossed, they didn't cross where the Ark of the Covenant was, but they were close enough to see it.